Good evening, everybody. I assume you've all seen by now, but we have the books over here. Finally, better late than never. Normally, when I write a study, this is the third time I've taught something here that I've written from scratch. And the previous two times, at least some draft of the book has been done before the class started. But considering I didn't know I was teaching this until 2 weeks beforehand, you didn't get that privilege, sorry. But the editions that are there do have all 4 chapters with corrections and amendments and addendums. For example, one example, which I will cut this part out of the video so people don't know I'm this stupid, but this is what happens when you write when you're tired. Remember back when we were talking about the Septuagint? And I said the Septuagint, and none of you called me out on this, you're all very, very nice. The Septuagint was written by supposedly 72 scholars. That's where it gets its name, the translation of the 70, and it's by the Roman numeral for 70. And in the book, I said, yes, the scholars were taken 12 each from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Do the math, folks. 12 times 12 is not 72. 6 from each tribe of Israel. That works out. So you are all commanded for every handout you got in previous weeks to burn them. And now you have the new and improved edition in the actual book in front of you. No, you don't. I just said you have to burn it. You don't go back and look at it. No. All right. So this is just a lesson that no, I am not perfect, especially when I'm writing at like 2 o'clock in the morning. So apparently math is the first thing to go. Exactly. Something else I just didn't come across, has been sitting in my office. I just, it processed my mind this week for some reason, is you'll remember when way back when we did the first class of the introduction, I talked about how this whole study was born out of the very first apologetic investigation I ever did. Well, I told you I went to my pastor at the time, and he really wasn't, he was spiritually helpful, but he couldn't direct me any particular resources. Well, the first resource I got was the Tim LaHaye Prophecy Bible. This is actually, and of course this is all very much Tim LaHaye theology, okay? So if you've read the Left Behind series, yeah, that's in here, okay? But it's broader than that. It's the whole Bible. So I found this has been sitting on my shelf in my office. And this is the very first book I ever purchased that got me into investigating apologetics. And when I opened it up, the first thing I see is on this first page, this is all my handwriting of different messianic prophecies that I was investigating. I would write down what the Old Testament prophecy was and what the New Testament fulfillment was. And this is nowhere close to even all of them. This is just as I was going through and I was doing my investigation, I was taking notes. And it's also proof that I have a very supportive and loving wife, because the last 2 entries are her handwriting. So, so she picked up at some point and started doing her own little investigation in messianic prophecies that she thought I had missed. I don't know if that's supportive or just, wives correcting their husbands, so it could be some of that too. But I thought this was kind of neat that I found this book there. It's like, oh yeah, this is what I'm talking about. That's from my actual investigation. So, all right, we're going to dive in tonight because we actually have more material to get through tonight than we have any other week. If you have to leave, at 7:30, I won't be offended, I promise. I'll just talk to an empty room for the rest of it to the camera if that's what I have to do. But we'll see how much we can get through. I mentioned last week that I wanted to talk about 3 prophecies. And once I started writing about those 3 prophecies, I realized any one of them could have taken up a whole class easily. So some of what's in the book we might not be going over tonight, but you have the book. So to kind of supplement some of it. But again, just like we do every week, I want to rehash what we've come to, where we've come so far, and what we've learned through the first 3 weeks of the study. The first thing we did, remember, we came up with a checklist, basically. We said, before we can know if Jesus Christ is the Messiah who is prophesied in Scripture, we have to know what that term means, and we came up with a certain number of criteria that he would have to meet. For example, he would have to be descended from David, right? We said that was one of the checklists he has to do. He has to be seen as a servant of the Lord. The Messiah has to be an eschatological deliverer, meaning something about the end times. There has to be something about his ministry that deals with delivering us in the final judgment, in the final days. He has to be a redeemer from sin. He has to be a perfect ruler. So we came up with all these check boxes to say, okay, now we know what we're looking for to see if Jesus and his ministry meets these check boxes. The next thing we talked about was how is prophecy intended to be interpreted? And we went through 4 different types of prophetic fulfillment, right? We talked about direct fulfillment, which is the easiest one to understand, right? We talked about typical fulfillment. We talked about applicational fulfillment and summary fulfillment, different ways you can see a prophecy being fulfilled. And then last week, we took a look at the major manuscript traditions of the Jewish Bible, of the Tanakh, and we compared the findings of the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Masoretic text. Remember, the Masoretic text is the manuscript tradition that Jews still use to this day, but it has about 1,000-year gap between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text. And by looking at those two, we were able to see not just how astoundingly well the scribes did their job, because over the course of 1,000 years, essentially there were no meaningful changes between the two manuscript traditions, but we also got definitive proof that these prophecies that we're saying point to Jesus as Messiah were never changed. Christians didn't corrupt them. They existed in their current form before Jesus was ever born. And that's going to be critical as we go through these 3 major prophecies tonight. Now, we've talked about a lot of prophecies already. Obviously, we've talked about the fact that the Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem, for example, has to be descended from David. So we've gone through some messianic prophecies during the course of the first 3 weeks, and we're really going to dive into 3 of them, the biggest ones tonight. But understand this, we're not even scratching the tip of the iceberg. Scholars will give you an estimate of somewhere around 300 Old Testament prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus. So when I was structuring this class, I deliberately did not structure it as, let's just go down the list, because that would get really boring really fast. But you need to know that we barely scratched the surface. We're talking about the major ones, obviously, and some of them are repetitive. I mean, there's more than one prophecy that calls him the branch of Jesse or the descendant of David, which are all getting at that descent thing, all right? So there is overlap with them, but there's a whole lot more we could talk about, but we won't because this is the last class. So tonight, we are going to answer the question that this has all been building up to. Do the prophecies really point to Jesus? Do they or don't they? Why is it that Christians say these prophecies very clearly can be, the only candidate to meet these prophecies is Jesus of Nazareth? They clearly point to his life. So what we're going to do is talk about 3 of them. All right, the first one, we're going to talk about the virgin birth, that the Messiah was born of a virgin. The second one we're going to talk about is Daniel's 77s. We'll talk about what that means when we get there. And the third one is probably the most powerful one, and that is the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. I love Isaiah 53 because I will read it sometimes to people who are maybe new to Christianity or don't know a whole lot about it. And I will ask them, what book of the Bible does that come from? Or even better, who's that talking about? And almost universally, the answer is, oh, that's clearly talking about Jesus. Great, what if I were to tell you that was written 700 years before Jesus was born? And then you watch the jaws drop, you know? So we'll get to that. That's a very, very powerful one. But can somebody please sing for me the opening lines of everybody's favorite Christmas hymn, Silent Night? Go ahead, you can sing it. Everybody together. She's timid, right? 1, 2, 3. You're not there yet. Keep going. And cut. There you go. The virgin birth is as much of our Christmas tradition and our Christmas story as the wise men, the shepherds, the angels, herald angels singing, if you believe Linus from the Charlie Brown Christmas special. No, that's not Linus's line. That's probably Lucy, right? Linus is the one that gets the story right. Anyway, so we all know that part of the Christmas story is that Jesus was born of a virgin. But where does that come from? And why do we believe that? Because obviously being born of a virgin in and of itself is pretty darn miraculous, isn't it? Now let's compound that and make it even more miraculous by me telling you it was prophesied 700 years before it happened. All right? And that's the question we're looking at tonight. The actual verse, which we'll get to more in a minute, is Isaiah 7:14, which says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel." And then when Matthew is reciting this verse, he reminds us that Emmanuel means God with us, right? It literally translates to God with us. So, does this point to Jesus? Was this a prophecy about Jesus' birth 700 years before it happened? Well, if you were to ask modern Jews or other skeptics, they would tell you no. They would say Matthew is completely taking this out of context. So what is the context? So what is the context of this prophecy? We're being told that we're taking it out of context. What is the context? Well, we've talked a little bit about this in previous classes, but around 734 BC, the northern kingdom, remember the kingdoms had divided between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, right? The northern kingdom actually struck a treaty with Syria because they were the big bad of the time. The Assyrian Empire was looking real darn threatening. And so the northern kingdom of Israel, remember there was Israel and Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel struck a deal with Syria saying, we're going to gang up together so we can take on and resist the Assyrian Empire. But the two of them together still weren't quite sure that they had enough power to hold off the Assyrian Empire. So they came to the southern kingdom of Judah. And Israel's like, hey, Judah, King Ahaz was his name. Remember the good old days when we were all copacetic together and we loved each other? Wouldn't that be a great thing to do? How about you come and join me with my new pal Syria over here, and we all form a three-nation union to try to stand up against the Assyrians? Well, Ahaz said, see ya, no, not going to happen, not picking that fight. That's your fight, you can have it, I'm not getting involved in it. Well, Israel and Syria didn't like that answer from Ahaz, so they decided, all right, you won't join us? Here's what we'll do instead. How about we just attack you? And we'll attack you, and we'll kill you, and then we'll put a king on the throne of Judah that is sympathetic to us, and then we'll still get our three-nation alliance. All right? Well, here's the problem with that. Aside from Ahaz freaking out because he thinks he's going to get killed, right? Understand that the ruler in Jerusalem was directly descended from David. Who else was supposed to be directly descended from David? The Messiah, right? And so the Jewish people that are remaining in the southern kingdom of Judah, they hear this and they're freaking out. Maybe they don't care so much about Ahaz, because Ahaz is not exactly a God-honoring kind of guy. He sacrificed his own children to the pagan god Moloch, okay? He is not your prime candidate for doing things right. But the Israelites still clung to that messianic hope. They knew the Messiah was going to be coming, but not if the messianic line got cut off in their minds. So you've got two concerns going on here. You've got Ahaz worried that his rule is going to come to an end because he's going to get killed, right? And you've got the Jewish people in Judah as a whole worried that this may be the end of the promised Messiah. And that's a big deal. All right? So what happens is God comes to the prophet Isaiah and says, go talk to Ahaz. All right? I want you to go have a chat with Ahaz. But I don't just want you to go, Isaiah. I want you to bring your son with you. Put a pin in that. Remember that. It's going to come back later. All right? So he says, I want you to bring your son with you. So Ahaz goes with his son. Isaiah goes with his son to talk to King Ahaz, right? And he tells King Ahaz, stop worrying. God says it ain't going to happen, all right? These invading nations are not going to triumph over you, so you don't have to worry about that. And by the way, Messiah is still coming, all right? You don't have to worry about that either. Jewish people, you don't have to worry about that either. And what he actually says to Ahaz, he says, here's what God tells me to tell you. To make sure you believe it, you, Ahaz, come up with a sign. Make it something miraculous. Make it something stupendous, all right? What he actually says is, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whatever, in the deepest depths or the highest heights. As Michael Rydelnik puts it, Ahaz was supposed to ask God to provide a sign that would be stupendous enough to elicit faith. So Ahaz, though, and we already know that Ahaz is not God-honoring, right? But he puts on this pretense of piety. He says, oh, no. I would never put God to the test. Really? You'll sacrifice your kid to Moloch, but you won't put God to the test. Isaiah doesn't buy it. All right, Isaiah sees right through it. And he says, because keep in mind, is it putting God to the test if God's the one that told you to do it in the first place? God explicitly told Ahaz to come up with a test, and Ahaz tried to say, oh, no, I wouldn't put him to the test. Okay, so he's being defiant of God right there. So Isaiah calls him out, all right, and actually what he does, starting in verse 13, all right, he actually shifts the tense of his verbs, of his language. All right. So up till verse 13, when this whole conversation is going on between Isaiah and Ahaz, Isaiah is using singular words because he's speaking to Isaiah individually. But then after Ahaz tries to pull this cop out, which really is just showing a lack of faith in God, Isaiah shifts. And he starts talking in the plural. And what he says is, house of David. Remember, who's the house of David? House of David is the nation as a whole, right? So he shifts to addressing the nation as a whole. He says, house of David, hear now, you house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? And then what he does, all right? Isaiah essentially says, if Ahaz won't come up with a sign, then God will do it for you. And keep in mind, what the conversation that's going on from this point is intended to address two concerns. Number one, the concern of the Jewish people that the Messiah won't come. And number two, the concern of Ahaz that he's going to be conquered. We've seen at the very beginning of this discussion, Isaiah has shifted to the plural. So which of those concerns do you think he's tackling first? The people as a whole or the individual Ahaz? The people as a whole, if he's speaking in the plural now. And this is what brings us up, and it brings us to the key verse, verse 14. All right? It says this, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Therefore, because Ahaz didn't do it, right? The Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. Again, that you is plural. It is not singular. It is a plural you in Hebrew. All right? So that's what brings us up to this point. And a lot of skeptics, what they'll do is they focus on the Hebrew word for virgin, which is the word alma, and they say that doesn't necessarily mean virgin. That can mean virgin, but it can also just mean young woman, and we think you're interpreting this incorrectly when you just say it has to be referred to virgin. We'll get to that more in a second. The problem is that the context doesn't end here. We have to keep looking and see what happens next. When you're reading a verse in context, which you should always do, you read before, you read after. Get the big picture. So what comes after this verse? Well, then we get into chapter 8. And chapter 8, at the very beginning of chapter 8, Isaiah shifts focus. And guess what he does? He goes back to the singular. He starts talking in the singular again. And then he says this, Then I made love to the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said to me, name him, Maher-shalal-hash-baz. For before the boy knows how to say my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the plunder of Samaria will be carried off by the king of Assyria. Damascus, Samaria, that's Israel and Syria. Okay? So again, remember, Ahaz's concern was about being conquered by these two nations. This is specifically telling him that there's this boy, which we'll talk about who that is in a minute, and that before he reaches a certain age, Assyria is going to come and wipe those two nations out. So Ahaz, you've got nothing to worry about. Do you start to see how this clearly is speaking to Ahaz's concern? All right, now this is not a messianic thing. This is Ahaz's concern about those two nations that are going to attack him. Now, a lot of interpreters and scholars blend these together, and they say that these are talking about the same son. All right, the same kid. It's all one prophecy. I disagree. And a lot of resources in the book you'll see that I've quoted also disagree with this for a number of reasons. Number one, what I already said. Isaiah very clearly shifted from the singular when he was talking to Ahaz to the plural to talk about the son that he called Emmanuel, and then back to the singular when he's talking about the son Maher-shalal-hash-baz. I'm going to try to say that 10 times fast, okay? All right, number two, in this second prophecy here, Isaiah specifically mentioned making love to the prophetess. Well, okay, I hate to have an anatomy lesson here, or a biology lesson, but if you made love to the prophetess, what does that mean the prophetess wasn't? A virgin, right? Now, obviously, this gets back to the proper interpretation of that Alma word, which we'll get to more in a minute. But if the Emmanuel prophecy was about a virgin giving birth, then this can't be the same kid, can it? All right? Number three, God tells Isaiah to call them different things. Now, keep in mind, these aren't like proper names. It's talking about the nature of the children. And the first one is called Emmanuel, God with us. The second one is called Maher-shalal-hash-baz, which means quick to the plunder, or swift to the spoil, all right? Which makes sense because the context he's talking about this kid is Assyria coming and conquering Syria and Israel and getting the spoils of war, all right? So you can see where the name ties into the rest of the prophecy here. All right, so what is the conclusion that I come to and Michael Verdelnik comes to is there's two prophecies here, all right? Because there were two concerns that came up, Isaiah gives two prophecies to address each. The first one is to address that concern about the Messiah might not come. The second one is to address the concern about Judah, the kingdom of Judah getting conquered. All right? And he uses different children to be the sign for each prophecy, to give the reassurance for each prophecy. But if they're not the same kid, if Emmanuel is referring to Jesus, who wasn't going to be born for 700 years, and I'm telling you this is second prophecy, then who is Maher-shalal-hash-baz? Take that pin out. Now you see why God told Isaiah to bring his son? Do I know this definitively? No. But does it make sense now? Yes. Because otherwise we have no explanation for why on earth God told Isaiah to bring his son. What this prophecy is basically saying is not just there's some hypothetical kid that by the time he reaches a certain age, these two nations that you're worried about will get conquered by Assyria. Isaiah is saying by the time this kid reaches a certain age, Assyria is going to conquer Israel and Syria, which gives Ahaz a visual reassurance. In other words, he can see how old this kid is right now that's standing here, right? So that gives him a very specific expectation as far as how long it's going to be before these two nations he's worried about are going to be wiped away by the Assyrian Empire, all right? Looking at the big picture, I think that makes more sense, all right? All right. So there are two prophecies here. One that's intended to reassure the Jewish people, and one that's intended to reassure Ahaz. The prophecy about Emmanuel is the one that's meant to reassure the Jewish people as a whole that yes, the Messiah is still coming. All right, and this is how Michael Rydelnik sums it up. He says, thus, having promised the virgin birth of the Messiah, the prophet then points to the small boy that he has brought along and says, before this boy, using the article with a demonstrative force, knows to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of the two kings you dread will be abandoned. Does anybody know anything about even modern day Jewish culture, about the significance of that language, about before he knows to choose the right from the wrong, to choose the bad and reject or choose the good and reject the bad? All right. There is a Jewish celebration that every child goes through that is to celebrate that time when they are now basically seen as being personally responsible for their own decisions. Anybody know what it is? Bar mitzvah, right? Or bat mitzvah for a girl. Exactly. So this idea is already ingrained in Jewish culture. So Ahaz, when he hears this, is going to know exactly what Isaiah is talking about. All right. So that's why I say that makes sense. Now, but then we still need to answer that other question about the actual Hebrew word that's being used here, Alma. Again, the allegation here is that the Hebrew word Alma does not mean virgin. It just means young woman. The argument's not without merit, folks. All right? Understand this. If you were to look at the broad scope of things, not just Scripture, all right, then it is... So the word Alma, yes, is used to mean virgin. It does mean virgin, all right? And sometimes it is used to mean young woman. All right, so it can be used in either context. The question is, how is it used by the Bible in Scripture, all right? And we have two different opinions about how to answer this question, both by very well-respected messianic Jewish scholars, all right? Michael Brown and our good friend Michael Rydelnik. I've referred to Brown in this class too before, but Brown, when trying to resolve this question of what the word means, says within the Tanakh, Alma does not in and of itself clearly and unambiguously mean virgin. In other words, he's saying there are times in the Scriptures where Alma is used to mean virgin. But there are other times where we can't tell for sure whether it means virgin or not. Therefore, his conclusion is, I don't think based on the biblical usage alone, we can say whether it means virgin or not. Whereas Michael Rydelnik, based on the same facts, kind of takes his interpretive structure and flips it around. He says the best way to determine the meaning of the Alma is by examining its usage throughout the Hebrew Bible, which I agree. If there were a place in Scripture where it clearly refers to a non-virgin, it would widen the range of meaning to make it possible that it might refer to a non-virgin in Isaiah 7:14. However, in every situation the word is used either of a virgin or in an indeterminate neutral sense. And we'll look at some examples in a minute. So here's the difference of opinion, folks. We all agree on what the facts of the Bible are. And that is there are verses where Alma clearly means virgin. And there are verses where Alma is used in the sense that we can't determine whether it means virgin or not. All right? It might not. But what there is not is even one single instance in the entire Bible where it is clear that Alma is referring to a young woman who has already engaged in intercourse. That is not there. So based on those facts, what do we conclude? Brown basically says, well, maybe from the Bible alone, we can't figure out for sure whether it's supposed to be a young woman or virgin. Whereas Rydelnik says, no. That if the only evidence we have in the Bible, the only clear evidence we have in the Bible is it referring to virgin. In other words, the only times we can clearly see what it means, it always means virgin, and the other times we just can't tell one way or another, then we assume that the biblical sense means virgin. Because the counterpoint to that is you're basically asking for the one exception in the entire Bible to be this passage in Isaiah. Personally, now I'll tell you, both of them still come to the conclusion that that it does support a virgin birth. But I personally think Rydelnik's right here. I think if you ever heard, there's a phrase that well, frankly, even atheists love to throw out there, and that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, meaning you can't, like, for example, if you say, I don't have evidence that hippopotami exist, well, just because I've never seen a hippopotamus, all right, doesn't mean there's not a hippopotamus out there somewhere. So just because I don't have evidence of something doesn't mean I conclude that that thing therefore doesn't exist. You need to have actual evidence that it doesn't exist, affirmative evidence that it doesn't exist. And that's where I think Rydelnik gets it right. Because all of the positive evidence we have is always it referring to this word meaning virgin. We don't have any evidence of it not referring to virgin. And given those two facts, I say, no, the more reasonable conclusion here is the Bible uses it to mean virgin. Let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about here. All right, Exodus 2:8. This is talking about Miriam in the book of Exodus, all right, Moses' sister. And she is referred to as Alma at a time when she was still a young girl, very young girl, still living at home with her parents. It's safe to assume she was a virgin, especially in that culture at that time. Then we get to like Psalm 46:1 and 1 Chronicles 15:20, all right, and even Psalm 68:25. These are all musical instructions. So in the Psalms, you would have, at the beginning of a psalm sometimes, you would have like an instruction for the director of music. And if the song was designed to be sung by a bunch of, well, almas is not the plural. The plural is, it's on here, hold on. Yes, alamat, all right, is the plural, alamoth, right here. That's the plural for alma, all right. If the song was designed to be sung by a bunch of alamoth, well, that's just telling you that that's who it's designed to be sung by. It doesn't let you conclude one way or another whether it's talking about a virgin or not. Which is why, by the way, these are all the NIV translations, and you'll notice in a lot of these verses, they don't even bother to translate it in that context. Literally, the NIV says alamoth in that instruction. Probably because it's like, we're still kind of throwing our hands up. We don't know in this context, right? Song of Solomon 6:8 is, I think, a very clear instance where Alma is definitely referring to virgins in context, because what it's talking about is King Solomon's harem, right? And who makes up his harem. And it says it has 60 queens, they may be. Well, what's queen? Queen's the women he's married, right? He was not following God's command on that one, all right? And 80 concubines. We all know what he's done with his concubines, right? All right? And alamoth beyond number. In the context there, if he'd slept with these alamoth, which category would they be in? Concubines, all right? So there's another a situation where I think pretty clearly is indicating he has not slept with these ones yet, all right? So these are, in fact, virgins. Proverbs 30:19, I have 18 and 19 on top here, is one of the more controversial usage of the words Alma. And what it says is, there are 3 things that are too amazing for me, 4 that I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a snake on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a young woman. Alma, all right? However, the very next verse, again, always read it in context, says, this is the way of an adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I've done nothing wrong. Again, I think at best you can look at this verse and say it's one of those situations where we can't tell if it refers to a virgin or not, but considering the very next verse contrasts it with an adulterous woman, I think the case is pretty strong that this probably refers to a virgin as well.
ESV says virgin.
I'm sorry?
ESV says virgin. The way of a man with a virgin.
There you go. Yes, exactly, and that's why. Because I think that's the better, frankly, interpret. This is the NIV, but I think this is that's the better translation, frankly, based on that. All right. Now, some folks will say that, even despite all of that, they say, well, look, if Isaiah wanted to say virgin, there was another Hebrew word he could have used, betula, which they say clearly means virgin. No, it doesn't. All right, it's the same situation. Betula, just like Alma, can refer to a virgin, sometimes also does not refer to a virgin. The Septuagint, remember we've talked about the Septuagint, right? Predates Jesus. Anybody want to hazard a guess how that translates the word? Virgin, basically. It's the Greek word parthenos, which almost always means virgin. Again, always, 100% of the time? No, but the vast majority of the time, Parthenos in Greek means virgin. So that again shows what was the Jewish mindset before Jesus was born, that this was a prophecy that Emmanuel was going to be born of a virgin. And here's the last thing I'll say about this. Remember the original context? Ahaz was told to come up with a sign that was so amazing that it was going to, for sure, elicit faith and confidence in God. And so those that don't think Alma means virgin want us to believe that that amazing sign was a woman had a son. What's so amazing about that? That happens every day, all right? The whole context shows it had to be something miraculous to fit the criteria. The translation of just young woman doesn't do that, all right? The translation of virgin does. So even if you think it's a 50-50 shot whether things refers to virgin or young woman, that alone tips the scale over to virgin. All right. So we see there in Isaiah, 700 years before Jesus was born, I think clearly we have a prophecy that the Messiah, God with us, was going to be born of a virgin, and Matthew shows how that was fulfilled by Jesus. The next one, Daniel's 77s. All right. We've talked about this a little bit. I can't remember which class, but I know we touched on it briefly. Week 2, when we were talking about direct fulfillment, I gave an example from Daniel 77 as an example of direct fulfillment. Daniel was a prophet. He lived in the late 7th and early 6th centuries, and he was actually taken off into captivity in Babylon, all right, like a lot of other Jewish people were. And then he wrote his book in about 536 BC, kind of relaying a lot of things that had happened in his life, and then looking forward prophetically to some things that were going to happen. And so at one point, he's sitting there in Jerusalem, or I'm not in Jerusalem, he's sitting in Babylon, and he's praying because the people are exiled, and he's sad, he's asking for God to have mercy on his people, and God, while you're at it, could you have mercy on Jerusalem as well? Your holy city is sitting in ruins down here. And God sends the angel Gabriel. And the angel Gabriel gives Daniel a vision. And Gabriel begins by saying, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. All right? So what these verses start out with, all right, is this is the introduction. We're going to come back to this at the very end of this prophecy, but this gives us a summary of what this whole prophecy is going to be about. But the first question we need to answer to understand this prophecy is, what the heck is a 7? And don't say it's a number between 6 and 8, because that is not helping us. All right? What the heck is a 7? All right. The word that is translated 7, all right, in Hebrew, literally means made up of 7s, like groups of 7, all right? Quite typically used to depict a week. How many days are in a week? 7, very good. So typically used to refer to a week, but not always. For example, if you remember the story of Jacob, Jacob wanted to marry Laban's daughter, Rachel. And so how long did Laban say he had to work for him to get his daughter's hand in marriage? 7 years. And so he worked 7 years, and then what did he do? Gave him the wrong daughter. So then what did he have to do? Work 7 more years. Guess what word we're talking about here? Same word. All right? So this says, because of this 7, some Bibles will translate this as weeks, the prophecy of weeks. Literally, it just means 7s, but that's why. Because we do see, even in Jewish culture, this idea of a week of days or even a week of years, 7 years. And if you read the prophecy in its full context, it's clear this is referring to groups of 7 years, because of what it says. Some of the things it says are going to happen just could not reasonably happen if it was talking about groups of 7 days. All right, so it's talking about groups of 7 years. The prophecy is also divided up into 3 divisions, 3 subsections. It splits the 70 weeks into a period of 7 weeks, a period of 62 weeks, and a final period of just 1 week. And we're going to go through those in a moment to show what Daniel says is going to happen, or really what the angel Gabriel told Daniel is going to happen in regard to each of those time periods. However, the first question is, a time frame means nothing to us if we don't know when it's supposed to start. We need to know when to start counting, and Daniel gave us that. All right? In Daniel 9:25, the start of the prophecy, Gabriel says this: from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Remember, I told you, the time that Daniel's getting this vision, he's been praying to God about the fact that Jerusalem is lying in ruins. So the first thing is Gabriel's telling him is there's going to be an order to rebuild it. That's going to happen. All right? From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, have we heard that word before? What's that mean? Messiah, right. You know the answer. You can speak louder. I know, but you said it very quietly. Messiah, the anointed one, the ruler comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So 69 out of the 77s will have passed before the anointed one, the ruler, comes. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, but we have a starting point. What this order to rebuild Jerusalem, well, what is that talking about? Did that happen? Yes, it did. All right, and this is a quote from Kevin D. Zuber. I won't go through the whole quote. It's in the book, but basically says there's 3 candidates for 3 different orders that some people think this might be referring to. The problem is the first 2 candidates only deal with the temple itself, not the city. And the context here is clearly the city. All right, so that's why most scholars say it couldn't have been referring to those 2. The last one, all right, which came down in 444 BC, was specifically about the city, all right, and specifically rebuilding the walls of the city, which, by the way, this is the setup for Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah and the book of Ezra, right? They're kind of like the sequel to this, because Ezra and Nehemiah are talking about how that happened, or what went on when they were rebuilding the city as a result of this order that came in 444 BC. So after Daniel got this vision, sure enough, this order came down. And so we have a starting point for our 77s. All right. Then, looking at their divisions, their first group is going to be a group of 7 sevens. 7 times 7 equals 49. Yes, very good. 49 years. And he tells us what's going to happen during that 49-year period. He says Jerusalem, we're still talking about Jerusalem, will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. Did that happen? Go back and read the book of Nehemiah. The answer is yes. Yes, that is exactly what happened. Is they did rebuild the city of Jerusalem. That much you should have known, because Jesus was kind of walking around Jerusalem by the time he was born. So obviously it got rebuilt at some point, right? But yes, during this 49-year period, that's exactly what happened. The city did get rebuilt, but not without opposition. Matter of fact, Nehemiah talks about them having to have swords on them because people would be attacking them while they were trying to rebuild the walls in times of trouble, exactly like Daniel's prophecy said was going to happen. All right, the next group, he talks about 62 sevens, but here he doesn't talk about something that's going to happen during those 62 sevens. He talks about something that's going to happen after those 62 sevens. All right, and what he says is after the 62 sevens, the anointed one, another word for that, Messiah, will be put to death and will have nothing. That seems pretty darn clear, doesn't it? Now, a gentleman by the name of, I can't remember his first name, Kevin Zuber, does the math for us. Now, understand that the Jewish calendar averages out, it varies, to my understanding, the length of the Jewish year actually can vary from year to year based on a number of factors, leap year being one of them, obviously. But the Jewish calendar did not run on 365 days. It averages out to about 360 days. All right, that's what the Jewish calendar worked out to be. Anybody want to hazard a guess? If you start at 444 BC and you run what works out to 173,880 days, what year you end up in? He probably says it on here, doesn't he? 8033. Anybody know what scholars think happened in AD 33? Jesus was crucified. Exactly. And again, even if you don't think Daniel was really written by Daniel all that time ago, the Dead Sea Scrolls make it so you no longer have the option to claim this was written after the fact. We have copies of this prophecy from before Jesus was born. Physical copies that were written before Jesus was born. So we know this is what it said before Jesus ever walked the earth. All right? Amazing. Now, what Zuber actually says is he thinks this actually points to the date of the triumphal entry, which is the Messiah coming into Jerusalem. And then after following that, obviously, was the crucifixion. Now, then it goes on, and Daniel's prophecy goes on to talk about that last week. But he actually describes several events that are going to happen in between, after the 69th week. We've already seen he talks about the Messiah dying comes after the 69th week. All right, but then he also describes some other events that are going to happen after the 69th week, but before the 70th week. For example, the people of the ruler who will come to destroy the city, the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and sanctuary. Anybody know if that happened? The people of the ruler who will come would be Rome, because Rome wasn't in power yet when Daniel wrote this prophecy. Did Rome at some point destroy the city of Jerusalem and the temple? Yep, 70 AD. It happened. And again, we have a copy of this prophecy from before it happened. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. We've certainly seen plenty of wars and desolations. Now, scholars will disagree about the 70th week and what it's describing. Some think the 70th week is describing events that happened around 70 AD. Others think that 70th week is a future week of the Great Tribulation that's going to come sometime down in the future. Now, the answer to that, the definitive 100% clear answer to that, just so you know, is the subject of a different Bible study, because that has nothing to do with the Messiah, so we're not talking about that. All right. So, no, obviously there's differences of opinion about what the 70th week does. If you want to dive more into that, I did do a series of podcasts a little while ago on the YouTube channel on the end times, where I dive more into the theories about that. All right. But there is a gap, clearly a gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. All right. Looking back at that original setup, at the very beginning, remember I said I gave you a summary of the prophecy. What Gabriel told Daniel, he said 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city, and then he laid out 6 objectives, basically, that were going to be achieved through this. Number 1, to finish transgression. Number 2, to put an end to sin. And number 3, to atone for wickedness. That group of 3, all right, generally refers to, all have something to do with sin. All right, you can see it. They all have something to do with sin. And while clearly we see that we still sin, all right, our sins have been atoned for. And even though we sin, if we have faith in Christ, is that sin counted against us? You're all Christians, you should know the answer to this one, right? No. Does God look at us as being sinners anymore if we have faith in Christ? No. So from God's perspective, our sin was completely declared, washed away at that point in time. And so a lot of scholars will say those first 3 are clearly referring to what Jesus was going to accomplish in his first coming. And then the last 3, to bring in everlasting righteousness, so true righteousness, actual righteousness, not just declared righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, meaning vision and prophecy are done. Why? Because everything's been fulfilled. All the prophecies have been fulfilled. And number 6, to seal, to anoint the most holy place, the heavenly temple, the perfect temple, the new heaven, the new earth. Those 3 are referring to what's going to happen at Jesus' second coming. All right? So, again, the recurring theme I have through here is, does God have your attention yet? Because if you know for a fact that that prophecy existed before Jesus was born, it wasn't changed after the fact, and if it clearly talks about the destruction of the city and the temple, which we know happened in 70 AD, that means whoever it's talking about had to be around before 70 AD. If not Jesus, who? Who? But there's still one more, all right? And that is, well, there's a lot more. There's one more we're going to go over tonight. And that is the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, all right? One of the beautiful things that I love about the Christian faith, and I think distinguishes it from any other world religion out there, is that we literally worship a God who's been there. If you are going through trying times, if you are going through pain, you are going through suffering, all right, and if I just personally don't see it as a real reassuring to have a God say, you can put your head on my shoulder and come to me, when he's so transcendent, so far above us, so completely unfamiliar with what it's like to be us, that he can't possibly understand what I'm going through. But God isn't that way, is he? God came to earth as a man in Jesus Christ. And so he literally has experienced what it is like to be us. And until such time as any of us are scourged with a horrible cat of nine tails that has pieces of bones on the back of it, is crucified with nails through our hands and feet, and then just for good measure, let's stab you with a spear to make sure you're dead, we have not suffered what he has suffered. Oh, and let's add, while you're doing that, to have all the sins of humanity placed upon you at that point in time, and feel God's condemnation for that. We have not suffered to the extent that he suffered. So we have a God who has been there and can understand what we're going through, so we really can't put our head on his shoulders. But what's even more amazing than that is this suffering that he was going to go through was prophesied 700 years before he was born. All right? And that's what Isaiah 53 is all about. It talks about the mission of the Messiah, and it even gives some specifics about what was going to happen at the crucifixion, as we see it. And again, if you don't want to say 700 years before, fine. Just say 100 years before, which we know we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't care. You want to be that hyper-skeptical, the conclusion's the same. The evidence is still there before Jesus was ever born. All right. So, Isaiah, all right, writes his book, and in his book there are a number of sections that have come to be known as the servant songs. And these are portions of his book that deal with someone who's referred to as God's servant, all right? Now, a lot of people will be tempted, there's 4 servant songs in there, and a lot of people will be tempted to look at these servant songs and assume that they are always talking about the Messiah. And that would be an incorrect assumption. Because the phrase, servant of the Lord, as we've seen already, yes, quite often does refer to the Messiah. But Israel as a nation is sometimes referred to as the servant of the Lord, all right, kind of collectively. And so when we look at these servant songs, we need to ask ourselves, are we talking about the Messiah here, or are we talking about the nation of Israel? And context, context, context. That's how you make that decision. All right. Michael Brown sums it up here, and again, I won't read the whole passage, but the word servant is ebed, all right, in Hebrew. And what he did is he compares all the times that it appears in the book of Isaiah, leading up to the 53rd chapter, but really the end of the 52nd chapter is where the servant song begins. And what he noted is that up until about Isaiah 48:20, chapter 48:20, all right, we see a lot of references to the servant being used in a group sense, being used to refer to the nation of Israel as a whole. But then after that point, especially when we get into Isaiah 49 and all the way through the end of chapter 53, context is very clear that now the servant of the Lord is talking about an individual person. The context can only apply to the individual person. It cannot reasonably apply to the nation of Israel. We'll see some more specifics about why that is here in a minute. All right. So, by the time we get to the end of chapter 52, again, everybody says Isaiah 53, but the song actually starts in 52:13, chapter 52, verse 13. But by the time we get to chapter 52:13, clearly the servant of the Lord is talking about an individual person. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this prophecy, not every single verse, but a lot of them. And, that's the rest of his quote. Anybody want to finish reading it? Sorry, go ahead. It was a long one. That's why I didn't read it all. All right, it's in the book. Moving on. All right, so let's take a look at this prophecy, and you tell me if some of this sounds familiar. I'm going to read a part of it, and you're going to tell me, let's just say, think of a certain first century Jewish rabbi named Jesus, and see if any of this rings a bell from what you've learned in Sunday school. All right? Starts out, Isaiah 52, verses 13 through 14. Says, see, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, just as there were many who were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form was marred beyond human likeness. So right off of the bat, at the very beginning of the servant song, we have Isaiah saying the servant is going to be highly exalted, but only after people are appalled by him and his form is disfigured. What's he talking about? The crucifixion. And what happened after the crucifixion? After 40 days after he was it was the resurrection, and then 40 days later, he ascended, and he is seated at the right hand of the Father, right? Exactly. See how it fits? Jesus was, in fact, disfigured and was, people were appalled by him. And then after all that happened, he was, in fact, glorified, raised, and lifted up and highly exalted. Moving on. Beginning of chapter 53, in verse 3, we get this one. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Was Jesus held up? I'll be honest with you, some modern Jews look at this and say, that wasn't Jesus. Jesus had a great following. Did he? He did when he was alive. What about when the chips were down? What happened during Holy Week? I'm sorry? They all abandoned him, didn't they? They called for his death. Those cheers of Hosanna on Palm Sunday all changed to cries to crucify him by Good Friday. All right? So we see what this is talking about. Moving on. Isaiah 53, still the next 3 verses, 4 through 6. Here's the meat of it, folks. All right? If you ever wanted somebody asks you what the gospel is, you don't even need to look at the New Testament. You can quote these 3 verses right here. This is what Christianity is all about. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. We talked about that one in an earlier class, didn't we? He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. We deserve the punishment, but he took it for us. It's right there, hundreds of years before Jesus was ever born. All right? Moving on. 53:7. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Was there a time around the crucifixion where Jesus did not open his mouth? Trial before Pilate, exactly. And I got the reference on there for you as well, Matthew 27:12 through 14. All right? And yet again, in case you didn't quite grasp the point of all of this, Isaiah comes back to it in verse 8. For he was cut off from the land of the living, for the transgression of my people he was punished. So first of all, the second part, for the transgression of my people he was punished. That's the substitutionary atonement thing again, right? We deserve the punishment, but he took it for us. But what does that first one say? The first part. Cut off from the land of the living. Tell me what that means in plain language. He died, right? The Messiah is going to die, just like we saw in Daniel's prophecy. It's here in Isaiah as well. The Messiah is going to die. Then we get to the very next verse. In verse 9, it says, he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. Who was on either side of him when he was crucified? Criminals. Where was he buried? In a rich man's tomb. All right, right there. Moving on, because Isaiah 53 is the gift that keeps on giving, people. Verse 10, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, and we'll see where it goes after that, again, we talked about this in an earlier class. An offering for sin is this Hebrew word asham, which is a guilt offering. It is the exact same Hebrew word used throughout the book of Leviticus to describe the guilt offering the Hebrews were required to give for their sin. Using the exact same word, says the Messiah is going to be that guilt offering. All right? And then again, the second part of verse 10, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. How can a dead man prolong his days? He can't. What's this talking about? It just said he's going to die. It's a resurrection. It's right there. Again, well before Jesus was ever born. It's all there. All right. So, does this, as convincing as I obviously think it is, and I've hopefully emphatically communicated to you that I think this is pretty astounding evidence, has every Jewish person on the face of the earth accepted this? No, not by a long shot. Why not? Well, there's several reasons, and there are some objections. The number one reason I think personally is a lot of them just aren't aware of it. Did you know that in their readings that they read in their weekly readings in synagogue, they actually skip over this passage? They go from 52, the beginning of chapter 52, and next week they start up with chapter 54. Now, it depends on who you ask. I mean, I think it's suspicious because it didn't always used to be that way. It used to be part of their weekly readings, and then for some reason it mysteriously stopped. I'm going to suggest a hypothetical that maybe it has something to do with the fact that Christians started pointing out how brilliantly this pointed to Jesus. All right? But I wasn't there at the table, so I can't tell you for sure. All right? But they don't read it. At a minimum, the result is that many modern Jews just aren't even aware of Isaiah 53. They've never read it because it's not read to them in synagogue.
I don't think they can understand it because they don't think the Messiah has come yet. So how could these things point to a Messiah?
Well, they don't think the Messiah has come yet, but that's kind of the point of Isaiah 53 and Daniel. Like, remember in Daniel, we can show, once you accept that Daniel prophecy is about the Messiah, and then prophesies the destruction of the temple and the city, well, I got news for you. The temple has not been rebuilt, folks. So that means if that's talking about the Messiah must have come before 70 AD.
Right, but what I'm saying is they don't think it happened.
They don't all think that happened, but some do. I mean, Toby Mann, who was here, to do the demonstration for us.
Do not think the Messiah has come yet until the lion lays down with the lamb.
Right, they do not. And there's different, we talked about this, I think, in week 1. There's different ideas about the Messiah. Some even say there's 2 Messiahs, Some think there's a Messiah of every generation, or potential Messiah in every generation, and the Jewish people just need to live up to it. So there's a lot of different theories about it, but you're right, they don't think the Messiah has come.
So they have a hard time understanding this chapter.
They do have a hard time because they've been taught a certain thing, and this, keep in mind what we talked about before, modern-day Judaism is really rabbinical Judaism, all right, in the sense that it's based upon obedience to the law. This whole idea of sacrifice is largely foreign to them now because sacrifices haven't been able to be performed since 70 AD. And so once that happened, the entire nature of Judaism changed. And so you're right, it's hard for them to understand because it requires them, frankly, to look at their own scriptures in a very different way, to look at them in more of a historical method of what did these mean to the Jews 2,000 years ago, as opposed to what am I being taught that they mean today. Now the temple's not here anymore. But I'll tell you the number one reason that you will hear that people will say this doesn't refer to, they'll say Isaiah 53 doesn't even refer to the Messiah. It's about the nation of Israel as a whole. That's the number one explanation that is given, or theory that's given to explain this away. Now, does that hold up? Is it possible? Because remember, we got to be fair. Earlier in Isaiah, I've already told you that yes, the word servant of the Lord does refer to the nation of Israel as a whole. That is a fact. Everybody agrees on that. So it's not too far-fetched for them to say it's still talking about the nation of Israel as a whole in Isaiah 53. But this is where I say context, context, context. In context, folks, that cannot be true. It just cannot be true. Here's a quote from Michael Brown, giving one reason why he says this is a completely ridiculous theory. He says, Isaiah presents a picture of a totally righteous, guileless servant of the Lord, According to the anti-missionaries, meaning Jewish people who disagree with this with Christian interpretation, this is a picture of Israel. But when did our nation ever live like this? When do the scriptures, or even our own history books, record a time when, as a nation, there was no deceit on our lips or violence in our midst? When we were as silent as lambs going to the slaughter before our oppressors? What generation could be called God's righteous servant? Yet if the national interpretation were true, Israel would have to be a righteous nation. At no point in our history has this been true. I mean, just look at the scriptures. Do the scriptures describe Israel as being a perfect gem, always doing exactly what they're supposed to?
No, when they would have been exiled so many times.
Exactly. Not at all. And yet, that's exactly how the servant is described in this passage. Does that sound like it's describing the nation of Israel? No. But it gets worse. All right? And this is also Michael Brown. For the Torah plainly promises again and again that if, as a nation, we live righteously before God, we will be the head and not the tail, lifted high and not brought low, blessed and not afflicted, revered and not rejected. What's the point? Well, if we're to believe that the nation of Israel is the servant of the Lord described in Isaiah 53, what does Isaiah 53 say is going to happen to that servant? Going to die? Going to get disfigured? Going to be disrespected? The Jews live under the old covenant, the Sinaitic covenant, right? That Moses gave at Mount Sinai. Anybody know what God promised in that covenant would happen to the Jews if they were obedient? I'm sorry? Yeah, the promised land. And a lot of good things, right? Did God ever say, hey, if you're obedient to me, then you're all going to die, and you're going to be disrespected, and you're going to be disfigured? No. So literally, to interpret Isaiah 53 as meaning the nation of Israel means you're calling God a liar. You're saying that God would be breaking his own covenant. All right, it makes no sense. Also, remember, we saw this whole passage where it was clearly talking about a substitutionary atonement, where one person was dying for another person's sins. If it's talking about the nation of Israel, it literally would be interpreting that as saying, but Israel was punished for Israel's transgressions. Israel was crushed for Israel's iniquities. It makes the entire prophecy just not incoherent, right? That's not what it's talking about. All right, now there have been some other theories. One of the other theories that has been put out there is that it is still talking about the nation of Israel, but it's talking about the nation of Israel in exile. Remember, they got sent off to Babylon and everything. And so when they go off and they live in these foreign nations, Israel's still the perfect gem. They're living perfectly. They're everything the way this chapter describes the servant. But the nations they're living amongst, they're not. And so inevitably, because the nations they're living amongst aren't obeying God, there's going to be some punishment upon those nations, and the poor, sweet, innocent Israelites that are living amongst these nations are going to receive some of that. That's the theory. This is, I say, kind of like a child who's gotten caught doing something wrong, trying to deny that they ever did it. You know, because the scripture says very clearly why Israel was sent off into exile. And it wasn't because they were oh so sweet and innocent and guiltless, like the Isaiah 53 chapter says. The prophet Ezekiel, well, this is another quote from Mitch Glaser. We got to go for time. Move on to the prophet Ezekiel, says point blank that the reason they were sent off into exile was for their sins, because they sinned. So again, this attempted explanation also denies Scripture. So wrapping it all up, does God have your attention yet? We have looked in this class alone at 3 prophecies, and we looked at several others before, that we know for a fact were written before Jesus was ever born, and clearly fit the Christian claims, the Christian gospel. They fit exactly with Jesus' life, right? Now, anybody ever read the book, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel? Parts of it? You should read the rest of it. It's a good book.
I even bought the kid version for my nephew.
Well, you could read the kids' version then. It's okay. No, but he has an interview in there with a gentleman by the name of Louis Lapides, all right, a mathematician. And Louis Lapides, which I'm probably mispronouncing, because one thing you learn in this class is I mispronounce everything, all right? I'd mispronounce my own name if I could. All right? He calculated the probability of one man fulfilling just 8 prophecies. Just 8. And he said the probability of just 8 prophecies being fulfilled is 1 chance in 100 million billion. That number is millions of times greater than the total number of people who've ever walked the planet. And that's just 8. I had to get my numbers right. I almost held up 7. That would have been embarrassing. 8. No, math is not my strong suit. That's why I married a math teacher. You know, I don't have to do math. Now, Lee Strobel himself went on to explain that he took it even further. He took his investigation even further. He said, I had studied the same statistical analysis by mathematician Peter W. Stoner while I was investigating the messianic prophecies for myself. Stoner also computed that the probability of fulfilling 48 prophecies was 1 chance in a trillion. I think I said 1 too many trillions? It's on video. We can go back and count. All right? I don't think that makes a difference. All right? And that's 48. Do you remember how many I told you he fulfilled? Around 300 prophecies. Does God have your attention yet? Folks, this was the first study that got me into apologetics. And I hope that coming out the other side of it, number one, that you've come to the same conclusion I did back then. And that it is just completely ridiculous to deny that God is not at work here. That there are prophecies that were written before Jesus was born that clearly pointed to him and only could have pointed to him. All right? And I also hope that this can do the same for you here in class, anybody that's watching the video after the fact, and that is inspiring you to dive deeper. The Bible says to test everything. The Bible says Jesus says, I am the truth, the way, the life. Jesus is not afraid of your questions. And that's probably the biggest thing I learned coming out of this. Because remember, I came out of law school. I learned how to cross-examine. I was cross-examining everything. And I got to admit, part of me had in the back of my mind that I wonder if this is really going to hold up. And at the end of this, I realized, yeah, God said he's not afraid of questions, and he's not. So that inspired me to ask more. And the more questions I asked, the more answers I got, and the more grounded my faith became.